So my grandfather had a gun, but it wasn't much of a gun. He had a little 25 semi-automatic that very gentlemanly he carried in his vest pocket. Because as a newspaper editor, he got into some rough situations sometimes, and it was always handy to be toting a piece. And he had a badge that said Fort Worth Police Department that enabled him to legally do so. Well, on the train, my granddad rode up with the two ranger companies, somewhere between Fort Worth and Borger, or actually they had to go to Amarillo and then to Fort Worth. On the Santa Fe, the clickety-clack of the rails lulled my grandfather to sleep. And when he woke up, Hamer, who was, like 6 foot forever, was standing over my grandfather, palming that little 25 up and down like that. He'd fished it out of his vest pocket. And my granddad said that Hamer used to brag that he could smell a gun on someone. And, Hamer, other people have said he had supervision. He could see a bullet. I don't know if that's true or not, but my granddad swears that he had given no clue whatsoever that he was packing. And that Hamer found this pistol and was standing over him when he woke up. Well, Hamer looked down at him and kind of, disdainfully regarded that pistol in his hand for a second. He looked at my grandfather and he said, "Wilkie," he said, "you better not ever shoot me with that damn thing and let me find out about it." He said, "When I go to hub a little hell, I want a 45. And, of course, the old Ranger slogan is, somebody asked a Ranger one time, "How come you carry a 45? And he said, "Because they don't make a 46. But, so anyway, they get to Borger. And the point of all this is, these are stories that I grew up hearing as a kid, and you can see, I hope, how it began to get me interested in the history of the Texas Rangers. They get to Borger, and again, because of the first thing they did was run all the prostitutes out of town. They ran 1,600 prostitutes out of Borger, Texas, in 24 hours' time. And just to make sure it stuck, the Rangers went around to all the dry cleaning establishments in town and confiscated all the dresses of the women and donated them to what few churches there were in town, just to make sure that they stayed gone. Well, and then of course then they set about the serious work, which was to try to run off the killers and the bootleggers and the gamblers and all the other riffraff. They had a very simple, non-constitutional technique that really, in a rough community, would still work to this day. Unfortunately, I'm sure it would be tremendously illegal. But what the Rangers would do, if they had a suspicion about somebody, they would come up and, without asking, they would grab that person's hands and they would look down at their hands and examine their fingernails. Well, if they were all oily and calloused and dirty, the Rangers figured it was probably just a good old boy, hard-working roughneck who was up there trying to make an honest living. If, however, they got a man who had nicely manicured, smooth, uncalloused hands, he went to the calahoose because he more than likely was a pimp or a gambler or running a speakeasy or something like that. Like I say, not very constitutional, but very pretty effective as a tool to calm things down there in the oil field. Well, so anyway, they get up there. My grandfather's there representing the Fort Worth Press. There's another reporter from the Houston Press, and at that time those two newspapers, long extinct, were connected, owned by the same company. And so my grandfather and this other reporter were working together and covering this military takeover of this Texas city. Because of my grandfather's connection to Captain Hickman, surprise, surprise, the Fort Worth Press was getting scoops over the larger and bigger staffed Fort Worth Star-Telegram and other newspapers in Texas. And of course the same stories were running in the Houston paper. Well, this was beginning to annoy Frank Hamer. He didn't like it. I guess he finally figured out probably where it was coming from. But my grandfather told me this story. He said that at one point my grandfather and the reporter from Houston were standing there talking somewhere amidst the chaos of Borger, and Hamer came up between them. He interjected himself between them, draped one big old arm over my granddad and one big old arm over this reporter from Houston. And he said, "Well, now I know how Jesus Christ felt, crucified between two thieves," and walked off. So that's what Hamer felt about the news media. My granddad said it's just a lucky thing Hamer worked for the press. For the state. Granddad lived to be 87 years old, and he said that Hamer had the coldest, deadest eyes on any man that he ever met in his 87 years of life. When they buried Hamer, he had about 7 pieces of lead in him and 17 bullet wound scars. For a man who lived such a violent life, he died of a heat stroke in Austin in 1957. But anyway, so that's how I got interested in the Texas Rangers. Then I followed family tradition. I too became a newspaper reporter. I dealt with the Rangers during the late 1960s. As Dick said, out in San Angelo, I worked for the newspaper out there. And in 1968, I remember one time, the last time anything big happened in El Dorado, Texas. You know, the most recent time something big happened in El Dorado was when the Mormons got busted there for their little escapades that were going on. Prior to that, it was some oil field vandalism that was attendant to a oil field strike in 1968. So the Standard Times sent me down there with a camera, and I arrive and I find not one but two Texas Rangers in El Dorado, Texas, investigating this vandalism of this battery of oil tanks. One of the Rangers I knew fairly well. He was stationed in Ozona and periodically came up to San Angelo, and so I already knew him. The other one I knew more casually. He was out of Alpine. And so I walked up to the one that I knew, and I said, now, wait a minute. I've always heard this legend of one Ranger, one riot, but here we have just one oil field vandalism case, but we've got two Texas Rangers. And without missing a beat, this Ranger looked at me and he said, Mike, he said, Arthur Hill's here for the vandalism. I'm here for you. So I thought that was pretty good to be compared to, as a young reporter, to a riot. But, you know, throughout the 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s, I dealt a lot with the Department of Public Safety and the Texas Rangers, various captains, as a newspaper editor and reporter myself. So in 1985, I ended up going to work for the Department of Public Safety as a public information officer. In baseball terms, that would be like being an Astros fan and suddenly you get a job working for the front office of the baseball team. I mean, you know, it was like they were paying me money to hang out with people that I'd heard about all my life, or of course the generational descendants of those people, and deal with them. And it was a fine, action-packed career that I was able to stand for 15 years. I finally got a little tired of the 4 o'clock in the morning phone calls and having to hop in a helicopter or a plane and go to, you know, the wilds of West Texas or somewhere else on a moment's notice. And so I left the Department of Public Safety. Still have a lot of friends there, people like Beth. But again, by this time I'm dealing with these folks every day, and so I decided, you know, I ought to do a book on the Texas Rangers. Well, the first book I did was actually a children's book that Ed Aiken, who at that time ran a press called Aiken Press, kind of talked me into doing, and I was real reluctant about doing it. I'd never written for children before, other than, you know, that 6th grade level you're supposed to aspire to when you're writing a newspaper story. But other than that, I never had. But I went ahead and did it, and it's proven to be a very successful book. It's still in print. It came out in 1991. It's in about its 8th or 9th printing now, and within a year or so we're going to be updating that book. Well, then I had always, or for years, I had been collecting books and information on the Texas Rangers, and so I decided to do a book that I ended up calling Texas Ranger Tales, which is just a collection of nonfiction, freestanding stories on the Rangers. Like, for instance, I had a chapter in that book on Borger. I used a picture of my grandfather that he'd given me as a young newspaper man, holding a newspaper in his hand with his snap brim hat on, and some of his recollections about being in Borger. That book also did fairly well. It came out in 1997, and so I followed that up with a volume 2 called Texas Ranger Tales, Roman numeral 2, very imaginative. And both of those two books are still in print. Well, in 1999, my wife will vouch for this, for years, probably before that, I had been saying, you know, I really want to write a definitive history of the entire Texas Ranger organization. And eventually I decided to do that. I was able to interest a New York publishing house in taking the project on. So in 1999, I swore and subscribed on a contract that I would finish a history of the Texas Rangers in 18 months, which would have been published in early 2000 or so, maybe 2001. Well, the volume 1 of that book finally came out in March of 2008. Volume 2 of that book came out in September of 2009. Fortunately, I had a very patient editor, Bob Gleason, who's still there, and at various times, he'd check in with me or I'd check in with him, and I said, "I'm sorry, I'm still working on it." He said, "That's okay." He said, "I know you're going to write a good book." Legally, he could have hung me up, and demanded the book or demanded my advance back or a portion of my advance that he'd paid me. But he didn't do that. He was very patient, and for that I'm very appreciative. I don't want you to think this is a complete love note to that publisher, because I have had my issues with them over other things, but I do respect them and appreciate that they did that. So I finally got the manuscript turned in 2005. I waited and waited, didn't hear anything, and so I called New York and I said, "Well, I sent you the manuscript. I haven't heard anything from you." And they said, "You did?" And I'd emailed it to them, and their firewall had bounced it out or something, and so they didn't even know that that I had done that, and so I'd lost another 3 or 4 months waiting to hear from those guys. So I sent it again. This time I was smart enough to call immediately thereafter and say, "Did you get it?" And they said yes. And so once again, of course, you hear this expression, faster than like in a New York minute, but that only exists their way. That doesn't exist all the time. That exists when they want it to be, but not when you necessarily want it to be. So again, I went a good while without hearing anything, and finally the editor called, and he said, "Well, Mike, I really like your book." And the way he said it, it was like, uh-oh, there's another shoe about to fall here, and I may not like the sound that it makes. He said, "It's kind of long," and when he said that, I thought, "Oh man, he's going to tell me to cut it." But he didn't. He said, "I like it so much." He said, "I want to turn it into a 2-volume history of the Texas Rangers." And he said, "That'll just make you more money." And I said, "Well, who am I to argue with that? I can't fuss about that." So, and that actually ended up giving me more time to work on not only on the first volume, but a lot more time to work on the second volume. In fact, I was still writing on the second volume about this time last year. And I had to rewrite the book, the ending, several times, because I wanted to work in the growing border drug conflict that's going on right now. And I was able to get in the fact that the Rangers were gearing up for that. The legislature appropriated more money to hire more Texas Rangers. And we'll talk about more of that in a minute. Well, what I tried to do in this book was to, I was very concerned as a writer and as an old journalist that since I had been a spokesman for the DPS for 15 years, that I might get accused by readers and or reviewers of being overly partial to the agency and trying to do just a puff piece. And I did not want to do that. I mean, I wanted to tell it straight down the middle in as close to journalistic fashion as I possibly could. And so I tell people, with apologies to Clint Eastwood, I tried to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly about the Texas Rangers. And I'll give you an example of each of those from my research and incidents that are in the book. A good example of the good, and I could certainly pick more, happened in the fall of 1858. A ranger company in Mills County was out on a routine patrol, which in that era was sort of unusual. They never had enough money in that era. I mean, even the modern Rangers will tell you they probably don't have nearly as much budget authority as they'd like, but back then it was really bad. They couldn't always have enough money to field a force, so it was kind of a hit-and-miss proposition. But in this case, there was a company afoot, or field, and they were out looking for trouble, and they soon found trouble. They found a set of pony tracks and started following those. They realized they were Comanches, and they followed the pony tracks to an abandoned cabin. It wasn't abandoned, but the people in it had gone. And these old rangers could read tracks, like you and I can read a newspaper or a book. I mean, they can look down and just see an obscure collection of impressions in the dirt, and they can tell you what happened based on looking at that. And so they could tell from these tracks that a wagon had left this cabin and was headed toward Pecan Bayou, which they call a bayou, but it's actually a river. It's a tributary of the Colorado River.